Welcome back to episode 2 of the Electric Election podcast. We are out here with Green Diamond Resources in Shelton, Washington. I'm alongside our host here, Benjamin Backer, and Doug and Neil, the president and COO of Green Diamond Resource Company. We're out in the forest because what you do is manage forests. Tell us a little bit about where we are.
Yeah, sure. So we're in Mason County, Washington. We're about an hour and a half southwest of Seattle. And we're out here in a commercial forest or timberland. This is a business that my family's been in since 1890. Literally, probably not too far from here, my great-great-grandfather started logging and growing trees here to make into lumber, and really within a few miles of here is where he started. So we're sustainable forestry people. We planted these trees. We're going to harvest these trees and turn them into lumber, and we'll plant them again. We'll continue that cycle. We've been doing it for 130 years, and hopefully we'll keep doing it for another 130 years.
It's pretty obvious that sustainability is at the core of kind of your belief system. Where did that come from, and how does Green Diamond Resources put that into use?
Yeah, so literally when we're planting something, I mean, maybe in the best case around here, we're talking about harvesting it in 40 years. So when you're looking that far out, you're really thinking about it generationally. And so decisions you make now that you're worried about what's going to happen for people half a century in the future. I mean, sustainability is really, really important. Like that, the decisions you're making now have such a long-term impact. So I think that's a concept that's been really baked into the culture of the company really before sustainability was cool. I mean, we've been doing it because that's what our business is. And I think in all parts of the company, we've attracted people for whom that concept and value really resonates. I know Neil's been here longer than I have, and I think that would you agree that that's
no, that's right. I'm a forester by trade, and so I started out working in the woods, swinging an axe in a forest not dissimilar to this one, cutting down little trees. And in fact, that same forest I worked in back then, 42 years ago, I still manage today. So it's a pretty special career to work for a company that treats the world in a sustainable way and allows us to continue to grow and thrive as a business.
And in so many ways, forest management, Neil, is so important. People talk about loggers like they're just taking away the trees and not putting back trees. And I'm really curious, kind of from your perspective, you talk about cutting small trees. What you're trying to do is really manage the forest so there aren't bad fires, so we can keep producing wood and we can actually maintain beautiful outdoor lands for everybody on all sides of the aisle.
Yeah, that's right. So we care about the whole forest land over time and generations. And so we certainly were interested in making it a business, but you have to culture it for 40 or 50 or 60 years to do that. In fact, we've taken on the role of not just managing trees now, we try to manage forests. And so we have a lot of people who help us who are biologists and botanists and hydrologists and so on. And so we're trying to manage the whole ecosystem. And now we're trying to do it beyond just producing timber, but also trying to make benefits in the environment for carbon sequestration. It's really exciting to see that.
Yeah, I guess going off of that, there are so many environmental benefits of forest management, right, in terms of the way that you all are focused on sustainable forestry. How did we get to a point where maybe the stereotype is the opposite, and how can we use simultaneously, how can we use forest management to help fight climate change?
Yeah, well, as we were talking before, trees are great sequesters of carbon, right? And photosynthesis is a wonderful, wonderful thing. You take a tree and you give it a little sunlight, you give it a little water, and it sucks carbon dioxide out of the air and makes it into wood. Wood is sequestered carbon. So to the extent that we can continue to have forests, that's obviously a great source of sequestered carbon because that's carbon that's not in the air. But even beyond that, to the extent that we use long-lasting wood products and we can harvest the trees in a sustainable way and replant them and reforest. We're harvesting 1 or 2% of our trees every year. And use those products that are in houses or in construction. We're sequestering carbon there as well. So the trees themselves sequester carbon, which is great, but it's, I think, even more important from a how do we decarbonize the atmosphere to make sure we have products that are sequestering carbon in your house and elsewhere where we can really use wood as an asset to address climate change.
The other thing we can do is managing a forest over time and space means that we care about it through its entire life cycle. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that we keep it free of disease and fire. And so doing these pre-commercial type activities that I started with as a young man in the forestry business, those things are investments. Those things don't happen for making money. They do it so you can protect the forest by not from being overstocked, but allowing it to grow a big forest like the one you see around you today. So having that sort of broader context of time, it's important for us to manage in a way that we're not just setting things aside and letting nature take its course. We're managing to an outcome. And that outcome sometimes means we're keeping fire away, we're keeping disease away, and we're making what we call a healthy forest growing.
I mean, you've been in the forestry business for 4 decades, right? And I mean, you've also probably, as such, have seen a lot of forest fires over the course of the United States, and especially here locally, there have been some really terrible years in previous summers. Thankfully, this summer hasn't been one of those so far. You know, where do you think we can go from here in terms of what seems to be, at least on the public side of things, fires that are worsening? Why do you think that's happening? What have you seen has helped? And kind of give us a breakdown on what we're seeing with forest fires today, especially right now when it's really on the top of people's minds.
Certainly climate change is happening, and it's not just upon us to sequester carbon, but also preserve the carbon that's been sequestered, right? And so one way to do that is through managing the ecosystems around us. Management is not a 4-letter word. Management allows you to get what you want in our natural environment. So if we want to keep forests free of fire, we try to keep ladder fuels away so fires stay on the ground, and when they're on the ground, we can put them out. We can't do it everywhere, but we can be smart about where we do it, and so we can manage to have fires be smaller in scope and less in frequency, and be able to manage fire as a tool instead of this debacle that releases more carbon than what all the cars in Los Angeles for a day or something. I forget what the stats are, but forest fires are unrelenting in their carbon releases and we can't control.
And the desire to stop these cataclysmic forest fires, Doug, that brings, let's say, an organization like yours, which is more on the business side of timber, and it gets you really in partnership with the passionate environmentalists. All of us want to stop this, as you said, the burning of this sequestered carbon. We're all on the same team.
Yep. No, it's an interesting distinction in America and in the West, principally where forest fires occur, is that in general, forest fires don't start and get big on ground that is actively managed. So in ground where we are, this is private timberland that our company owns, and it's not that forest fires don't get ignited here, people throwing cigarette butt or lightning, but because they're managed in such a way to manage the fuel load and contain access, we're able to put them out very quickly. And that's true not just here, but in other parts of the West. There's a real challenge facing publicly owned forests, which don't have any revenue source, and so can't afford to do some of these treatments that, as Neil said, are investments. Meaning, you have to put money in order to get the results.
See, you guys have a lot of amazing conservation efforts, but before we get to that, can you explain a little bit about what forest management means with Green Diamond, and like how that sort of application of forest management helps prevent forest fires? Because I think to a lot of people, this might be the first time they've ever really heard that can be a major catalyst in preventing wildfires. So can you talk through kind of what those sorts of, you said the ladder fires is one example. Can you give a couple examples of what that looks like?
Sure. Neil, you're probably better suited to do it.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, creating ladder fuel opportunities is one way. Also thinning forests to make sure that you can keep the fire from becoming a crown fire. Crown fires cannot be stopped. And so once you lose control of it, then sometimes you have to do some very clumsy things to manage the fire, things called backburning, where you go away from the fire and burn away from the wind so that when the fire reaches something, it's already burnt. But that just doubles the size of fires. And it's an important tool that we have to have, but it's one of those tools of last resort. So if you can get to a place that has been thinned where the fuels are allow you to keep the fire on the ground, that's going to give you places to shelter firefighters. It's going to give you a place to be able to put a place where you can have a last line of defense, and it's going to give you a place to stop a fire before it gets to that next debacle and runs through the next ridge and creates a doubling in the size.
There are different uses for forestry, different uses for forests, and I don't think almost anyone in the forestry industry would say, hey, we should be logging everywhere. There are places that have great natural beauty, that have great recreational opportunities, that have great ecological value. And many of those are preserved, and maybe there should be more that should be preserved, whether they're in parks or in wilderness areas or whether they're areas of special conservation. And then there are other parts of forests, there are other forests that are used for more commercial purposes, and this is one of them, right? And well, we can have multiple benefits out of this. We're primarily managing this for a commercial reason. And so what we care about here is making sure the trees are healthy because we want them to be growing. And that's great news from a carbon perspective, but it's also great news from a fire suppression perspective because the forests that are most at risk to burn are the ones that are not healthy, where you have a lot of dead and dying trees that are susceptible to fire and susceptible to insects. And so that is not at all to say that we should expect to be able to control all the fires, because there's some that will occur in wildernesses where they're a natural part of the West. But what we want to do is make sure that we don't let them get out of control and also burn in places where we'd like them not to burn.
It almost sounds like there's this like really easy innovation that's available by taking, a private company like yours, potentially partnering with public forest lands, and instead of having it be, mass timber, it's more just coming in to do the management, right? Because if you seem to have a system that produces less fires, why can't we make that match?
Yeah, I think that that's been a challenge. I mean, I have sympathy for the Forest Service, which has historically managed millions and millions of acres, much more than we manage. It's has a massive remit, but they, I think, the public's desire for what to do with forests has changed, and as a result, it's changed the requirements that we've asked of the Forest Service, and we've taken away some of their resources too. So. Well, part of the reason we can do the things that we do in terms of preserving the health of the forest and doing the thinning and doing the investments in the infrastructure that we do is because we're generating revenue from selling logs. And without the revenue to pay for those things, we wouldn't be able to afford to do the type of forest health prescriptions that keep the forest healthy. And so in the case like the Forest Service, they just don't have the revenue. And so it's really hard for them to do on a broad scale the type of investments in healthy forests. And I think that's a big public policy question, and I'm not sure. I'm certainly not saying we should be doing a lot more logging in the Forest Service, because I think that's a public policy issue that I think the country is kind of settled on. But it is a challenge. Like now we have to figure out how to pay for some of the investments in the forest that we have to do in order to keep them from all burning up.
I think it's a really good point. And as a old Gen Z or a young millennial, I grew up watching the Lorax. And I'm sure you've seen that, you've read that. It obviously instills this sense of protecting the environment and having like your own personal leadership role in it. But it seems like it might have also gotten a decent bit wrong and set maybe a precedent that has been somewhat harmful in terms of the stereotype of how we look at the environment, and that maybe these things aren't that simplistic because it kind of sticks with people. Has that been something that you've felt like is an issue?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there are a couple of things. And Sully, if you're about to say something, please go ahead.
But it's more just, it sounds like we got to innovate and make a profit to be able to actually protect the environment. If we take away the ability to make a profit, how can your company reinvest in this forest?
Yeah, I mean, one of the counterintuitive things is that places where logs are more valuable, you actually have more forests, right? Because people are protecting them. In places where logs are not valuable, that's where you lose forest, because people want to say, hey, we need to do something else with this land that makes it productive. And so when you see in the Amazon, when you see square miles of forest being lost, it's not because they're logging that and making money off the logs. I mean, they are at some point. Mostly what they're doing is they're burning it and turning it into agricultural fields and whatnot. So in places where you say, hey, we're going to create a healthy market, and there should be appropriate regulation about what activities occur in the forest, I think we're all for that. It's nice if they're stable, but we can live within the rules. As long as they're like effective regulation, stable regulation, and there's a market for the product, then we will see forest land continue to be forest land. In places where trees and logs and the forest economy doesn't work, that's where you see this really detrimental things, fractionalization of land ownership and poor forest management. You see fires. You see a lot of other tough stuff. To say nothing of the local communities, which really suffer from not having a resource to drive their economy. So it does seem counterintuitive. So the Lorax, sure. I think that in some respects, the question of the Lorax is what was the bad thing? Was it the cutting down the trees, or was it the converting the timberland into something else? Mm-hmm. And I'd say, okay. There are ancient trees around, and I believe we should protect those, right? Those are the cathedrals of nature, and those are super cool, and keep them protected. this is a 35 or 40-year-old crop that we're growing. And to the extent that we can continue to make this a productive and sustainable resource and industry, then this is going to stay in the forest. And in the 39 years of the 40 years of its life that we're not logging it, people are going to come here and enjoy it. The various forest ecosystem is going to work. So hey, it was just the other day that my son said to me, "Aren't clear cuts bad?" And I had to say, look, this is a sustainable resource. In order to get trees to grow, you need to have sunlight on the forest floor. And the only way we're going to get new trees is by getting sun to the forest floor. Trees are trees, otherwise they'd be ferns, right? If they didn't need sunlight, they'd grow on the forest floor. So it's a challenge in some respects because there are some parts of forestry are visually, they're arresting. But it's just like cutting down a wheat field, right? At the end of the day, you need to cut it down.
We missed the whole life cycle because really, Neil, you are the Lorax, right? Not only do you cut down the tree, but then you plant the tree, right? And you rebuild this forest. So you say 40 years, you say you've been working 40 years. You could have planted this forest we're standing in right now when you cut it right at the beginning of your career. And that's where we're missing it. You're part of this cycle.
Yeah, and that's my disappointment in that narrow view of how forestry works. It's just the harvesting, and it's just the visual impact of having tall things go into long things, so to speak. But what you really miss in all that is the 98% of the time when we're culturing and growing this forest, and we don't just sit back and wait. As I said before, we have a lot of scientists that help us understand how to grow this forest in an ecosystem context and in a societal context. We have a saying in our business: we want to know more about our forest than anyone else, and so we use that data to help manage it properly to get the kind of outputs that we want for not just timber harvesting, but because we own a public trust resource. We don't own the fish or the water, right? And so we're taking custody of those resources while we manage our forests around it. And we want to do it in an efficient way, and we want to achieve the outputs that the society requires of us. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of it. I like to claim we have more scientists per acre than anywhere else in the world, and I think it might be true. I don't tell Doug that.
To get into some of the specifics, you have really focused on a lot of incredible sustainability efforts that, as a private landowner that also focuses on the timber industry, I think would be interesting for people to hear about. Can you talk through some of those sustainability initiatives and how that improves the environment on top of everything we've already talked about?
Well, and specifically that something got signed right here where we're standing. There's some history, kind of not just in the trees themselves, but in the commitments you've made to sustainability here.
Sure. Well, in both Washington and California, where we also operate, we've signed several, I guess now 4, voluntary habitat conservation agreements. These are voluntary agreements that the company Green Diamond enters into with the federal regulators in order to agree that we give more than is required of us in terms of improving voluntary conservation measures in return for some assurance that we can continue to do these things for a certain amount of time. And actually, it's a great story of collaboration where we say, hey, we think that if we do this, it's actually going to help coho salmon or spotted owls or Humboldt martin or Pacific fisher more than is required by the law. And we're willing to do it. We just want to have some certainty about what we're going to do because we're making investments now that do last 40 and 50 years. And it's really helpful for us to have certainty about what's going to happen at the tail end of that in order for us to feel confidence in order to continue to invest in the business. So those are voluntary things that we're doing, and part of the deal is you have to monitor them to make sure they're working. And we have 22 years of really voluminous data on this stuff, and it does work. I mean, Neil, it's been a large part of your career.
Yeah, that's right. I was there at the signing ceremony, and the first HCP ever given to a private landowner in September 17th at 2 p.m. on 1992. And so, and we renewed that plan about a year ago, added more species to it. It was the first plan to manage for spotted owls that was, as I said, ever granted to a private landowner. But it took a little trust between us and the agencies, and we spent 30 years building more trust with them so that we could renew it and then, in fact, add more species because we knew more about them over time. So I would say the vast majority of our landscape in the West, when you include a newly minted agreement we have in Oregon, is covered by one kind of long-term landscape permit. These permits last anywhere from 30 to 50 years and encompass essentially all of our lands in the West.
So on the spotted owl tidbit, spotted owls are an endangered species for those who don't know, right? And why have they thrived on privately owned land that you have been managing? And can that be a model for other areas? Is that a model for other areas?
Well, we had to generate the answer to that question before we were allowed to apply conservation, because there was some thought that these were refugee owls. We had more owls than we could count at first, and they were coming from the forests that were being cut down and coming to our lands, and that they were only slowly going to die away. So we had to prove through science that they were producing and breeding and so on. And so that application of the scientific method allowed us to generate this notion that, yes, managed forests can produce these rare things. I like to claim we have an abundance of rare things. That's why we have to do these long-term permits. But it's also a testament to the value of the ecosystems we provide. They're not just one thing. They're not just one type of management. We have trees of every age class, and we have mixed age classes, and we have riparian areas. So we have a lot more abundance of variety, you might say. And I think that this sort of edge effect, it creates a lot of value for wildlife.
I'd say kind of on a high level perspective, it sounds like we have to make a profit, we have to innovate, and we need to constantly be investing in the environment around us. What would you hope maybe public officials think about when they weigh into such a heavy topic as climate change and environmentalism, and they try to vilify the company? But I swear, Benji, as we get deeper into this, and I feel like I'm going to say this over and over again, it sounds like we can't actually protect our environments unless we're actually making a profit and investing. The government's not going to weigh in and do these innovative things. What are the kind of the next steps that you would like to see from public officials to expand really what you're doing to keep these forests safe?
Well, keeping the forest safe is one question. I'd say I think even at a level higher than that, there are real existential threats to some forests. Fortunately, not these forests, but from climate change. And I think there is a real opportunity to use forests as a tool and forestry as a tool to address climate change. I mean, we touched on it before, but like the most efficient sequester of carbon is photosynthesis. These trees are breathing in carbon and breathing out oxygen. And so to the extent that to the extent the government wants to spend money or taxpayer resources or resources in general to address climate change, there are ways you can do that with forestry. There are policies and incentives that can be put into place that would change management practices that would increase and expand forestry, have the trees grow faster, and have the forest cover over more areas. I think we get into a lot of specifics about where and when and how, but more trees and more use of wood in solid wood products is part of the solution. And honestly, I think when you look at how much that would cost, you read these things about people who are trying to capture carbon dioxide and pump it into the ground and do clean coal and all that sort of stuff, and they talk about how much it's going to cost to do that. And it's like a couple $100 per ton of CO2, and it's way more efficient to capture it through forestry. There can be changes to forestry practices that will sequester more CO2 in $20 a ton. I mean, a tenth of the cost. And we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg of that a little bit, but there's tremendous opportunity to really use forests as a tool to fight carbon change.
Well, just following up on that, I mean, it seems like when we're about to embark on this road trip, the common question that I get is, which renewable energy sources are you going to visit? Which I think that we are so siloed into thinking that that's the only answer, right? And I think that obviously we're going to visit renewable energy sources that are doing amazing things, but we forget about these natural solutions that can help solve climate change and reduce emissions and grow the economy at the same time. It seems like it's starting to pick up steam, and people are starting to realize that restoring wetlands and planting trees can be even more effective than maybe some of these other alternatives. How can we get this to be more mainstream, and where are you playing on the climate change side of things? Are you planting a significant amount of trees to fight climate change, or how are you weighing in on the issue to help kind of change that dialogue?
There's one important distinction I would say, and we have a big challenge with climate change.
Huge.
And the one of the things that is daunting about it is we have both a flow problem and a stock problem, meaning we are continuing to emit a huge amount of CO2, and replacing fossil fuels with renewable clean energy is essential to try to address that issue. And that's going to be hard, and there are going to be areas where it's easier, and there are going to be areas where it's harder, and that's a big challenge. But we also have a stock issue. We have too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And if we don't address that, it's going to be really hard to get the train off the tracks. And so renewable energy, solar, wind, energy efficiency, biofuels, those are all great ways to address the flow issue, reduce the amount of CO2 going in. But there are really not that many ways to address the stock issue. The stock issue, how do we decarbonize the atmosphere? This is the way to do it, right? Take more of the carbon out of the air and put it into wood.
Well, just think about where we're going to go to next, Vaughan Timbers, on the next episode, where they're at the innovation side of timber with cross-laminated timber, where you're actually, having less environmental outputs from these buildings that are using old, kind of less useful trees. I think that's what gets me so excited about all these conversations. I'd almost throw it to you, Neil. We got about 5 minutes left, but what do you think about those lumber innovations on the backside, where these trees go, the cross-laminated timber?
No, I think that's a great question. Thank you. I was thinking about, while you were talking about this, the notion that it's not just putting carbon in that tree, which is a great way to sequester it, but when we harvest it and manage the forest, we also produce products that supplant things that have higher carbon uses, like steel and framing in buildings with mass timber. We can go up 6 or 8 or 10 stories, which allows us to sequester that carbon in a product in a building. We can take the byproducts from harvesting and put it in a power plant and generate electricity, supplanting the use of fossil fuels. So if you look at the whole life cycle, our ability to do this, not just the carbon in the woods, but also the carbon that is supplanted by us putting our carbon outputs against steel and electric generation from less carbon-friendly sources.
Yeah, and I really think that that's a huge part of it, because there's this huge life cycle of the timber industry that goes from planting a tree to maybe someone's house or someone's office building, and the entire process can help the environment. Is that right?
Yes.
It's all carbon sequestration.
Right, and it helps the environment in the context of all the other things we talked about for wildlife. We're not despoiling the environment while doing it. We're doing it in the context of a landscape that improves habitat for many of these animals, with long-term agreements with the state that do not just a monitoring of what we do, but adaptive management. We learn as we go, and we apply the lessons from that on the landscape to make the world a better place for all the things that we care about. So it's a really great story. I just wish we all lived to be 300 years old. We'd see it over and over again.
And I think the magnifying glass, putting it on sustainable forestry, is really important, because there are so many ways that it hits this environmental side. And just to kind of recap, I mean, it's preventing wildfires, which emit CO2, which is a big problem. It's taking in carbon on its own. It's helping provide conservation. It's more sustainable building materials. It's actually, we haven't talked about this, but water quality, I know you guys focus a lot on that. Yep. I mean, it's just, there are so many positive net benefits to sustainable forestry that I think it's important for the United States to think about on a much more granular level than we have been. And I think, to your point, there's a stock problem that maybe we don't focus enough on. We need to figure out how to fix the problem in the future, but we also have to fix the problem currently. And the stock problem is a current problem, and we can solve it through sustainable forestry. And that's what you are doing with Green Diamond, in a way that I think can leave a legacy for other companies in this space. I guess to wrap up, is there anything else that you're incredibly proud of on the sustainability side that we haven't talked about that you would love to have our viewers know about?
We have the luxury of being a long-tenured, family-owned business. We get to look out longer than most other businesses do. And so, well, that comes with a lot of responsibility, that we do the right thing. We're able to go and, in many cases, buy timberland that has been managed wrong, we would say. I mean, abused, and say, hey, this is going to take a generation for us to fix this. But in a generation, it will be fixed, and it will now be a recovered ecosystem, and it'll be a recovered asset that can produce returns, and it's just going to take a long time for us to get there. But if we do the right things now, we'll end up with a better piece of land, a better forest, an economic return that's not great, but it's positive, and a positive impact on the world around us. So I'm proud of that.
Tree hugging to the nth degree.
With capitalism, though, like, that's the one thing that I keep on hearing is, like, if we forget that we need to make a profit, we're never going to be able to maintain these forests. Capitalism and environmentalism is actually the innovative solution. Everyone else saying that we need to get rid of capitalism to save the forest, I think, well, they've just never had an opportunity to talk to Neil at the Green Diamond Resource Company.
Conservation at its finest. I mean, I think that that's really what we need to lean on, is this conservation paired with business, paired with smart government. That's the solution. And you have to have these market-based solutions to get things done.
Neil, as the Lorax in our midst, I want to give you the last word here, because you've been in this forest for 40 years. What do you want everybody to take away from your knowledge and kind of commitment to this forest?
Well, I'll say something a bit personal. I'm the luckiest man you've ever met. I've had a career working for this enterprise to be able to deliver on these ideas and be able to see the outgrowth of conservation planning in place, to be able to be on the vanguard now of the next generation of that, and to put it in place where we can make maybe a huge difference in the midst of climate change. So I wish I could start my career over again. It would be just as fun the next 40 as it was the last, but it's been a great pleasure to work for a company that embraces those, that manages itself by values. And so I am the luckiest forester you ever met.
Well, that is amazing, and I think he's got 40 more, don't you?
I think he's got it. Well, and we're about as lucky to be out here with you. This is, again, episode 2 of the Electric Election podcast. Everyone's got to stay in touch. They got to come back for episode 3. I'm getting inspired, Benji.
I know. I by the end, I don't know if we will ever have anything else to inspire us, because we're just, every time it seems to get even better.
I really actually need to stop using the word inspired. I think I'm energized, and it's time to get to work.
Yeah, it's time to get to work. We've got an entire country to see, but we've seen some amazing solutions so far, and I think, the heart of the Pacific Northwest are its trees, and we've seen how that can positively impact the environment and the economy at the same time, and it's time for us to go east.
Yeah, on to the next conversation. See you guys next. Welcome back to our second after show podcast. We've gone nowhere. It's almost like we're right back in Bozeman, Montana.
The studio with all those different backgrounds is just over yonder.
Well, we have this incredible green screen. For the people who aren't, the people who are tuning in on video, not the podcast version, but it's our after show podcast, number 3, episode number 3. We just got off, you just finished watching and learning about Green Diamond Resources, an incredible logging company in Washington. And honestly, the crazy issue, Benji, is we're 2 weeks later, and we're engulfed in smoke now. There's smokes all up the West Coast. We were talking about forest management, and then these fires hit, and it feels really weighty, because in this conversation, the bit that has stuck with me so much as we've had all these, journeys, and I just want to bring it back from the podcast, is that kind of statement of, there's all these out there technologies. You can do nuclear. You can, pull the carbon out of the atmosphere with your crazy machines. But, man, just plant a tree and maintain your forests, and we'll stop destroying our environment at these cataclysmic levels, because these fires are out of control fires from forests that haven't been maintained, and you're getting 10, 20-year burns that are far beyond the environmental impact of even cities.
Yeah, and you're seeing companies like Green Diamond Resources, who have taken care of their land for literally generations, have much better success at preventing these forest fires from happening. And Green Diamond Resources is a sustainable timber company. They're in the business of planting more trees to help the environment, and then harvesting them when they're at that point to create sustainable building products. That sort of business model has helped them prevent wildfires on their land on the Olympic coast, where wildfires are ravaging that part of the country right now.
Well, and it's, for everybody who's watching and listening, it's almost a preview. We're right here on Ted Turner's ranch in Bozeman, Montana. And one of the things that was mentioned on this podcast, tune in later, is that the federal forest lands aren't being as well maintained. And there's some fear that there will be a big fire there that'll take everything out. And this isn't trying to avoid climate change. This isn't trying to avoid what we need to do to combat things 10, 20, 30 years down the road. But honestly, with the fires behind us, everything that we've seen, what we've driven away from in Seattle, we need to take action in the next 6 months to a year, Benji.
I know it seems crazy in 2020, but 2 things can be true. And that's the problem.
sorry, that got me.
There are problems with climate change as it pertains to forest fires. But that's not the only problem. And the way that we can prevent these fires from literally engulfing this background is to understand that also forest management is so important. And that's the story of Green Diamond Resources. And it's also the story of how two things can be true.
Well, and I almost point out, a couple days ago, you had the Department of Natural Resources in Washington kind of put out this same message. You have Hillary Franz, a not superintendent, she's a public lands commissioner in Washington. She's not trying to get everybody to talk about climate change. Literally, she's just looking for budget to do work in the forest right now.
Yep.
and she'll then later talk about climate change. And so
because she knows both matter.
Yeah, and it's such a bummer, right? Because right now you'll have, somebody like Jay Inslee who he'll point to climate change. Only. That's it.
Right.
And then you'll have maybe somebody on the other side say, well, those were all arsons.
Right.
Maybe there was arson. Maybe climate change is creating an environment where these forests can burn more. And then maybe we actually didn't manage our forest correctly. Yep. Maybe we just need to realize that.
Maybe three things are true.
Ooh, this is some next level. This is 2021.
Okay, yeah, we got to wait till 2021 to talk about that.
Yeah, but this was a powerful conversation. It was kind of dry in many ways, but it's because you're learning the nuts and bolts. But the message is so huge, and we should have seen it coming. I mean, we were literally engulfed in fire after that.
Yeah, it's a very pertinent conversation for what's going on around us across the country right now. And it kind of shows that, as we look towards policies and practices ahead of next summer and ahead of next summer's forest fire year, that maybe we can do something a little bit differently and start heading in the right direction. And like you were saying, these are steps that we can take right now. These are things that we could literally start doing today. We saw Yellowstone, which was incredibly, packed with dead brush. We could go in there today and clear that dead brush out. Those are things that you can do right now.
Well, and it's these smaller logs. The less useful quote unquote timber is now starting to find use with cross-laminated timber. I mean, and that's one of the most exciting conversations that we have coming up in the podcast is with Vaughan Timbers for people who are going to stick around and really join this journey, because I think there's this potential one day where, and I don't think it's going to happen this year. But you could put out a permit for a company like Vaughan Timbers to come in and clean up Yellowstone, and then they'll create cross-laminated Yellowstone timber, which I could see people paying a lot of money for. And instead of doing it kind of the Hillary Franz style where you have to spend $100 million of our taxes, we could actually get the logging companies to come in and do what they do best, which is keep these forests healthy, keep them maintained, and actually, make a dollar, which is okay. It is okay to make money while cleaning up the environment.
Make money, live better. Environment.
Well, keep tuning in. It's the Electric Election Roadtrip. We haven't even left Washington, but we've left Washington.
We're not in Washington, but we are. But we're not. It's confusing.
Stay tuned. We got another episode coming up. It's really exciting. We're talking. We're going to swim, right? Next.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're meeting up with Ron Allen, a tribal leader there. He really has done great stewardship in the Dungeness Bay, and there's a ton to learn. We have to go build trust in local communities and learn from everyone
and return to our roots.
Yeah, this can't come from D.C.
Yeah.
Well, with that, you're coming from all across the country, so are we. We'll see you soon. Next episode of the Electric Election Road Trip.